Section 1. The calm before the storm it all began on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in the normally serene neighborhood of Willow Creek, the kind of community where the most exciting event was usually someone hosting a bake sale or mowing their lawn just a little too early on a Sunday morning. But that tranquility was shattered the moment Karen Thompson, the infamous HOA tyrant known for her obsession with control and perfection, decided to escalate her reign of terror beyond petty complaints and neighborhood squabbles straight into criminal activity. My neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, a gentle elderly man with a love for gardening and an uncanny ability to whistle along to any tune, had just returned from a morning spent tending to his prized rose bushes when he noticed Karen lurking suspiciously near the edge of his driveway. At first, he thought it was another of her usual complaints. The HOA had been on his case about the slight tilt of his mailbox for months, but as he squinted under the bright sunlight, he realized her intentions were far darker. Karen, armed with a duffel bag and an oddly intense look of determination, was rifling through his garage with rapid, almost panicked movements, tossing aside boxes and haphazardly searching through shelves, muttering under her breath about taking back what's rightfully mine and teaching him a lesson for defying HOA standards. Mr. Jenkins froze in horror, his hands clutching the handles of his gardening gloves as he tried to process the scene unfolding before him. This was no longer about aesthetics or bylaws. This was about theft, and Karen's audacity left him momentarily paralyzed with disbelief. As he slowly reached for his phone to call the authorities, Karen's eyes snapped toward him, her expression twisting into one of rage and defiance. "What do you think you're doing?" she barked, her voice echoing across the neatly trimmed lawns and manicured hedges, causing a few curious neighbors to glance out their windows. In that split second, Mr. Jenkins realized he was dealing with a version of Karen he had never imagined. The petty, overbearing HOA officer had transformed into a criminal mastermind in his own driveway. The thought alone made his heart race, his chest tightening as adrenaline surged through him. But he didn't panic. Instead, he backed away slowly, keeping Karen in sight while trying not to provoke her further, and whispered into his phone as he dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos erupting on his property. 911, what's your emergency? It's my neighbor, Mr. Jenkins stammered, his voice quivering with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Karen Thompson. She's trying to steal my belongings. She's breaking into my garage, right now. The operator instructed him to stay on the line, and within minutes, or what felt like an eternity, the flashing lights of police cars pierced the calm suburban streets, sirens wailing a sharp counterpoint to the peaceful morning that had existed only moments before. Karen, sensing the approaching authorities, tried to stash the duffel bag under a tarp in the corner of the garage, her movements frantic and reckless, but she wasn't quick enough. I, standing a few houses down and having noticed the commotion from my porch, grabbed my phone to film what was unfolding, knowing that Karen's arrogance would be her undoing. As the first patrol car screeched to a halt in front of Mr. Jenkins' home, two officers jumped out, their eyes narrowing as they took in scene. Karen, frozen mid-action with her hands full of Mr. Jenkins' personal belongings, looked from the officers to the camera of my phone and back again, realization dawning on her face. The look of shock and panic etched across her features was almost comical, yet terrifying in its intensity. "Step away from the property," one of the officers commanded, his tone firm and unwavering. Karen's voice rose in a desperate protest, her usual authoritative demeanor completely unraveling. "This is my neighborhood. I'm the HOA compliance officer." The officers didn't flinch, and with coordinated precision, they approached her cautiously. Karen's hands shot up in a gesture of feigned surrender, but her eyes darted nervously to the bag of stolen items, betraying her intention to flee or continue the theft if possible. One officer calmly instructed her to sit on the curb while the other began inspecting the garage, uncovering the full extent of her attempted robbery. Tools, gardening equipment, and several personal items belonging to Mr. Jenkins now scattered in disarray across the garage floor. The evidence was irrefutable, and Karen's protests grew louder, more frantic, and increasingly desperate as the reality of her situation sank in. Neighbors had begun gathering at the edges of their yards, whispering in shock and disbelief, some pointing fingers, others shaking their heads in stunned amusement at the absurdity of the scene. By the time backup arrived, Karen's bravado had completely evaporated. She was seated on the curb, hands cuffed behind her back, muttering to herself about how the HOA bylaws had failed her and how they'd all regret this. Officer Jenkins, whose calm, methodical approach to gardening had been the foil to Karen's chaotic intrusion, stood beside the patrol car, shaking his head but managing a small, incredulous smile. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the gathering crowd. The officers, professional and unamused by Karen's theatrics, read her rights, carefully noting the stolen items for the official report. Meanwhile, whispers and murmurs rippled through the neighborhood, a mix of horror and vindication. Everyone who had endured Karen's petty tyrannies finally witnessed her arrogance backfire in the most spectacular fashion. She had gone too far this time, and the consequences were immediate and undeniable. As the officers escorted Karen to the patrol car, she struggled and protested, but the chain of accountability was unbroken, and the flashing red and blue lights reflected not just on the pavement, but symbolically across the neighborhood. A stark reminder that actions have consequences, no matter how entitled or powerful one believes themselves to be. Mr. Jenkins' garage, though in disarray, remained his own. The items Karen had attempted to abscond with were carefully returned to their rightful places under his watchful supervision. Neighbors, emboldened by the police presence, began discussing how Karen's obsession with control had escalated far beyond reasonable bounds, and how it had threatened not just property aesthetics, but the very safety and security of the people around her. And I, still holding my phone, knew that this footage, this irrefutable evidence, would be more than enough to ensure that Karen faced the full weight of justice, not as a petty HOA tyrant, but as a criminal caught red-handed. By the time the sun dipped low over Willow Creek, casting golden hues across the suburban lawns and neatly trimmed hedges, Karen was gone, escorted to a police vehicle, while the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. The ordeal had been shocking, humiliating, and terrifying, but it also served as a powerful reminder of the thin line between authority and abuse and the consequences that follow when entitlement overrides decency. Mr. Jenkins, dusting off his hands and surveying the chaos in his garage, shook his head and chuckled softly. "Never a dull moment," he said, and for once it was true. The calm of the neighborhood had returned, but now with a story that would be told for years, a story of HOA tyranny pushed too far, a criminal attempt thwarted by courage and the law, and a community finally witnessing justice in action. Section 2, The Fallout and Neighborhood, whispers the aftermath of Karen's brazen attempt to rob Mr. Jenkins didn't settle as quickly as the flashing lights of the patrol cars had disappeared down the quiet suburban street. Instead, the ripples spread through the neighborhood like a storm that refused to dissipate, leaving everyone on edge, yet secretly exhilarated by the spectacle of her downfall. That very evening, as the sun dipped behind the neatly lined rooftops of Willow Creek, neighbors lingered in their yards, forming small clusters and whispering with a mixture of awe and disbelief, exchanging every detail they had witnessed, filling in the gaps of each other's perspectives, and savoring the fact that the infamous HOA tyrant had been caught red-handed. Children, usually relegated to the background of Karen's vigilant patrols and constant rule-mongering, now played freely in driveways and lawns, laughing and shouting as if liberated by some invisible decree that had restored not only physical safety, but a collective sense of control that Karen had long monopolized. Among these conversations, speculation and gossip mingled with righteous indignation. How long had Karen been capable of escalating her petty obsessions into criminal action? Who else had been quietly victimized by her obsessive enforcement of trivial rules, her invasions of privacy thinly veiled under the guise of community standards? The answers were murky, but the evidence of that afternoon's events, the duffel bag, the disarrayed garage, the police intervention, spoke loudly, forming an unassailable narrative that would haunt her reputation indefinitely. Inside the Jenkins household, the sense of relief was tempered by lingering anxiety. Mr. Jenkins meticulously began returning each displaced item to its rightful place, taking care to handle even the smallest tools and objects with the reverence one might reserve for fragile heirlooms, all while recounting the ordeal to anyone who would listen. He described Karen's frantic, almost manic movements, her eyes wild with desperation, and her repeated declarations of entitlement to what wasn't hers, all delivered in a tone that mixed indignation with a kind of diluted righteousness. "I can't believe someone could do this," he muttered, shaking his head as he sorted through his gardening equipment. "To think that she'd come into my home, my sanctuary, and think she had the right to take what I've spent years collecting, it's absurd. And yet here we are." His voice wavered, betraying both exhaustion and a simmering anger that had been building over months of Karen's petty complaints, fines, and manipulations. The garage, now a testament to both chaos and resilience, bore witness to the lengths one person's obsession could reach and the consequences that inevitably follow when unchecked power collided with law and accountability. Meanwhile, across the street, Karen's own home became a focal point of scrutiny. Her neighbors, emboldened by the dramatic turn of events, kept a watchful eye on her movements. Curtains twitched nervously, blinds were drawn, and whispered conversations filled the air as the community collectively processed what had just occurred. Karen, for her part, appeared uncharacteristically fragile, pacing her living room in a manner that betrayed a cocktail of humiliation, fear, and simmering anger. Calls to lawyers, frantic attempts to frame the incident as a misunderstanding, and desperate messages to the HOA board were met with polite but firm refusals to intervene. Even those who had once hesitated to oppose her authority now understood that her credibility had been irrevocably compromised. Her frantic energy, once a force of intimidation and control, now seemed almost pitiable, a stark contrast to the calm, methodical efficiency of the officers who had apprehended her and the supportive network of neighbors who had witnessed the event firsthand. The very presence of law enforcement, combined with Mr. Jenkins' quiet dignity and careful documentation, created a situation in which Karen's words could no longer carry weight. Her claims of authority sounded hollow, unconvincing, and desperate, echoing against the walls of her home like the shrill remnants of a storm finally spent. The HOA board, for its part, convened an emergency session the following morning. The usually bureaucratic and measured members found themselves grappling with the fallout from Karen's actions, their collective sense of responsibility toward the community and individual residents sharpening into a focused clarity that had been previously clouded by fear of her influence. Detailed reports were presented, including eyewitness accounts, photographs, and even the video footage I had captured from my own porch, all documenting Karen's reckless and illegal intrusion into Mr. Jenkins' property. The board members, who had long tolerated her overzealous enforcement of petty rules and arbitrary fines, were now confronted with indisputable evidence that her obsession had escalated to criminal behavior. Discussions that had once centered on fence heights, mailbox standards, and garden aesthetics now shifted to questions of liability, legal exposure, and the ethical duty of the HOA to protect residents from the abuses of those in positions of supposed authority. By the time the session adjourned, a unanimous understanding had emerged. Karen's tenure as a compliance officer could no longer continue without jeopardizing the integrity of the HOA and the safety of the neighborhood. As word of the incident spread beyond our immediate circle, the media began to take notice. A local news crew arrived within days, their cameras rolling as they interviewed Mr. Jenkins' neighbors and even HOA board members, capturing the narrative of entitlement, obsession, and criminal overreach that had culminated in Karen's apprehension. The footage, aired that evening, painted a picture of both outrage and relief, highlighting not just the audacity of her actions, but also the collective resilience of the neighborhood. Viewers were captivated by the image of Karen, cuffed and defiant, juxtaposed against the calm dignity of Mr. Jenkins and the reassuring presence of law enforcement. Social media quickly amplified the story, neighborhood groups and local forums filled with debates, commentary, and shared anecdotes about her previous antics. For the first time, the wider community could see Karen for what she truly was, not an authority figure to be feared, but a woman whose obsession with control had blinded her to the law and common decency. ultimately leading to her public exposure and disgrace. Within the neighborhood, this chain of events catalyzed a dramatic shift in dynamics. Residents who had long endured her petty tyrannies began asserting themselves, engaging in conversations they had previously avoided, and openly questioning the relevance and enforcement of rules that had been imposed arbitrarily. The collective energy transformed from one of quiet resignation to cautious empowerment, each neighbor drawing inspiration from Mr. Jenkins' courage and the visible consequences Karen faced. Children played more freely, adults tended to their properties without fear of sudden fines, and a renewed sense of community blossomed as shared laughter, storytelling, and mutual support filled the void that fear had once occupied. Even those who had been neutral or hesitant to intervene found themselves emboldened, realizing that Karen's intimidation could be countered with evidence, solidarity, and the law. By the end of the week, Karen had been formally charged, and the police investigation was well underway, marking the beginning of a legal reckoning that would ensure her actions had lasting consequences. Meanwhile, the neighborhood, though still wary of her potential maneuvers, began to breathe again, its rhythm restored by the simple realization that one person's obsession, no matter how relentless, could be countered by courage, preparation, and the unwavering support of law and community. It was a lesson etched not only into the memories of those who had witnessed the event firsthand, but into the very culture of Willow Creek, a reminder that integrity, vigilance, and solidarity could triumph over tyranny, and that no matter how audacious a bully's ambitions, the truth would always find a way to surface. Section 3. Karen's desperate manipulations and community resistance in the days following her arrest. Karen Thompson's obsession with control and reputation did not wane. If anything, it became more frantic, more desperate, as she sought any avenue to reclaim the power she had so publicly lost. Behind the drawn blinds of her house, she plotted endlessly, pacing from room to room, phone clutched tightly in her hand, leaving a trail of scattered papers, unreturned calls, and unchecked anxiety. Her first attempt at damage control involved a series of frantic calls to HOA board members, where she spun convoluted stories, painting herself as a victim of exaggeration and bias, insisting that Mr. Jenkins had provoked her and that the police had misunderstood the situation. Each conversation was carefully crafted to sow doubt, but the calm professionalism and collective memory of the board members rendered her manipulation ineffective. They were no longer intimidated by her threats or her claims of authority. Instead, they questioned the veracity of her words, noting the irrefutable evidence collected by the officers, the photographic documentation, and the growing chorus of witnesses who had observed her actions firsthand. In neighborhood groups and message threads, her frantic messages were met with skepticism, cautious criticism, and in some cases, outright ridicule, signaling a shift in perception that marked the beginning of her isolation from the community she had once dominated. Karen's next tactic involved attempting to manipulate her neighbors, hoping to find at least one person who would corroborate her version of events. She went door to door, presenting herself as calm and composed, carefully curating her tone to exude contrition while insinuating that Mr. Jenkins had somehow been in the wrong. But her usual aura of authority, the subtle intimidation she had wielded so successfully for years, had crumbled under the weight of public exposure. Neighbors, emboldened by the police's intervention and the documentation that clearly showed Karen's intent to steal, met her with firm resistance, polite refusals, and in many cases, cold indifference. We saw exactly what happened. One elderly woman told her gently but firmly, "We all did. There's nothing you can say that will change that." Her attempts to sway anyone to rekindle fear or respect fell flat, and she left several homes that day with her pride shattered and frustration mounting. The whispers of her prior petty tyrannies now transformed into a collective acknowledgement of her failure, and she began to realize that her influence over the neighborhood's narrative had vanished. Where once she had orchestrated fear, like a conductor leading an orchestra, she now found herself ignored, unheard, and increasingly desperate to regain control. Simultaneously, the legal process began to unfold with meticulous attention. The police investigation into Karen's attempted theft was thorough, with officers documenting every detail, collecting testimony from Mr. Jenkins' neighbors, and even the HOA board members who had witnessed her descent into criminality. Her attempts to minimize her actions during interrogations were met with firm questions and cold scrutiny, leaving her visibly shaken as the weight of the law began to close in. Court notices, subpoenas, and warnings were delivered with a formality that Karen had never encountered before, and each interaction reminded her that the safety net of HOA intimidation no longer protected her. The officers, professional and unwavering, repeatedly emphasized that her actions were no longer a matter of neighborhood squabbles, they were crimes under state law. The gravity of the situation began to manifest in subtle ways. The forced cancellation of HOA meetings she had intended to manipulate, the careful scrutiny of her communications by authorities, and the realization that any further attempts to intimidate neighbors could result in additional charges. The meticulous legal process, often slow and methodical, contrasted sharply with her impulsive, chaotic methods, and the frustration this caused was visible in her increasingly erratic behavior. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself began to assert its newfound empowerment. Residents who had previously hesitated to confront Karen now spoke openly about her behavior, sharing stories of harassment, intimidation, and absurd fines. Children played freely in front yards, and neighbors organized informal gatherings to support one another and celebrate the restoration of their shared space. The collective morale soared, bolstered by the knowledge that one person's obsession could be contained and held accountable through unity, documentation, and the law. Mr. Jenkins, once quiet and reserved, became a symbol of resilience, his stories circulating through neighborhood chats and local news, inspiring others to stand up against petty tyranny. Karen's attempts to sow discord were no longer effective. The community had built a collective immunity to her manipulations, strengthened by shared experiences and a growing network of support. The transformation was palpable, from hushed whispers of fear to confident conversations about neighborhood rules, property rights, and the importance of standing together in the face of overreach. Karen, observing these changes from the isolation of her home, grew increasingly frantic. Her movements became erratic. She sent poorly constructed emails to the HOA, posted incoherent messages on neighborhood forums, and attempted to leverage minor HOA rules in an effort to intimidate neighbors into silence. Yet, every action only served to further expose her obsession, her lack of credibility, and her inability to recognize the limits of her authority. The police remained a silent presence, monitoring complaints and ensuring that Karen's desperation did not escalate into further criminal activity. Her once mighty aura of intimidation was replaced by a reputation of instability, a cautionary tale that traveled faster than her own attempts at control. As the days passed, Karen's influence waned, and the neighborhood began to thrive in a way it hadn't in years. The lake sparkled with recreational activity, children's laughter filled the streets, and conversations were filled with hope and community rather than fear and repression. Karen's failed attempt at theft had inadvertently united residents, fostering a sense of solidarity and empowerment that no petty rule or fabricated complaint could dismantle. Even those who had previously been neutral or indifferent now actively supported Mr. Jenkins, the HOA board, and one another in ensuring that the neighborhood remained a safe, fair, and respectful space. Karen's frantic manipulations, once a source of anxiety and control, had been rendered powerless by transparency, courage, and community vigilance. By the time the sun set on Willow Creek, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, Karen's shadow over the neighborhood had faded, replaced by the warm glow of resilience, unity, and the knowledge that justice had prevailed. Her obsession with authority, so carefully nurtured for years, had become her undoing, proving that no single individual, no matter how cunning or aggressive, could dominate a community armed with truth, law, and unwavering solidarity. Section 4, Karen's last-ditch efforts, and the neighborhood pushback. Karen Thompson, isolated and cornered by the consequences of her attempted robbery, grew increasingly erratic. Her desperation manifesting in a flurry of poorly conceived schemes and frantic messages designed to intimidate, manipulate, and regain control over the neighborhood she had once ruled through fear and overreach. From the safety of her home, she attempted to rally support from sympathetic neighbors, sending long, impassioned emails that cast herself as the victim, claiming that she had been misunderstood and that Mr. Jenkins had somehow provoked her actions. Each email was riddled with inconsistencies, overblown rhetoric, and transparent attempts to manipulate emotion, yet the response was resoundingly cold. Recipients who had long endured her petty fines and arbitrary complaints now shared the messages openly, forwarding them to the HOA board and even the local police department as evidence of her continued instability. She tried phone calls next, calling individuals in the middle of the day, leaving threatening voicemails, and demanding that they retract statements or support her side of the story, but the law enforcement presence, the documentation, and the collective awareness of the neighborhood had rendered her intimidation tactics powerless. Every attempt to reassert authority only further exposed her volatility and eroded whatever credibility she still held in the eyes of neighbors. Meanwhile, the HOA board, informed of each attempt by Karen to interfere with proceedings, acted swiftly and decisively. They convened emergency sessions to formally discuss her actions and implement strict safeguards, ensuring she could no longer access HOA resources or manipulate neighborhood processes. The board, which had once been wary of confronting her, now exercised authority with clarity and resolve, guided by evidence, law, and the support of the community. They documented each complaint, secured copies of emails, and coordinated with law enforcement to ensure that any further interference would be met with immediate legal action. Karen, watching these measures unfold from her home, became visibly agitated, her movements erratic, her voice raised in frustration as she attempted to make sense of her dwindling influence. Her usual aura of confidence, which had intimidated so many residents for years, had crumbled under the weight of accountability, transparency, and community unity. At the same time, the police continued their investigation, conducting follow-up interviews with neighbors, reviewing footage, and compiling reports for potential charges beyond the initial attempted theft. Their presence, while unobtrusive, reinforced the message that Karen's actions were no longer merely a matter of neighborhood gossip or HOA bylaws. They were criminal behaviors under the full scrutiny of law enforcement. The combination of legal oversight, HOA safeguards, and neighborhood vigilance created a multi-layered barrier that prevented Karen from regaining her control and signaled to the entire community that her reign of intimidation was over. Her frantic attempts to undermine this network only highlighted her lack of foresight and inability to adapt to a situation in which rules, law, and collective accountability were enforced fairly and consistently. Neighbors, emboldened by the unfolding events, began to assert themselves in ways that had previously been impossible. Residents who had quietly tolerated Karen's petty tyrannies now spoke openly in HOA meetings, documenting past infractions and sharing personal experiences of harassment, intimidation, and arbitrary fines. Children played freely in the yards, laughter filling the streets, and community gatherings were organized to foster trust, communication, and cooperation. The collective empowerment of Willow Creek grew, transforming fear into unity and demonstrating that a neighborhood bound by mutual respect, transparency, and support could withstand even the most relentless attempts at domination. Karen's frantic phone calls, emails, and social media posts were met with polite but firm rejections, reinforcing the clear message that her authority was no longer recognized and that any attempts to interfere would be immediately reported to the police. As the days passed, Karen's erratic behavior became more pronounced. She attempted to trespass on properties under the guise of conducting official HOA inspections, only to be met by vigilant residents and, in some cases, police intervention. She tried filing new complaints against Mr. Jenkins, claiming harassment or misconduct, but each filing was meticulously documented and dismissed by both the HOA and law enforcement. Her credibility, once a powerful tool, had become a liability, and the community watched with a mixture of awe and relief as her schemes unraveled before their eyes. The narrative of the neighborhood shifted decisively. Karen was no longer a figure of fear. but a cautionary tale, a symbol of how obsession, entitlement, and disregard for law can lead to public humiliation and legal consequences. By the end of the week, Karen's final desperate attempts had completely failed. The police had formalized additional charges for harassment and attempted theft. The HOA had reinforced boundaries and protective measures for residents, and the neighborhood had achieved a sense of security and empowerment that had been absent for years. Mr. Jenkins, once the quiet target of her obsessive behavior, was now celebrated as a symbol of resilience and dignity, his courage inspiring neighbors to engage more actively in community life. The streets of Willow Creek buzzed with normal activity again. Children played freely, neighbors tended to their gardens without fear, and the oppressive shadow of Karen's tyranny had finally lifted. What remained was not just a restored sense of order, but a powerful lesson. Unchecked obsession and abuse of authority can only succeed temporarily, and when faced with law, community solidarity, and unwavering documentation, even the most audacious attempts at domination will inevitably crumble. Karen, isolated, legally constrained, and publicly discredited, could no longer threaten the peace, unity, or freedom of the neighborhood, leaving Willow Creek to reclaim its tranquility, its dignity, and the simple joys of daily life unimpeded by fear or intimidation. Section 5, Justice Served and Neighborhood Triumph, the final chapter of Karen Thompson's reign of terror unfolded with a mix of anticipation, tension, and a sense of vindication that swept through Willow Creek like a long-awaited storm breaking a season of oppressive heat. The legal proceedings, which had dragged on with meticulous detail over the preceding weeks, reached their crescendo in a small but packed courtroom, where the air was thick with the collective energy of neighbors, law enforcement, and the representatives of the HOA, all bearing witness to the reckoning of a woman who had once wielded fear like a weapon. Karen, sitting at the defendant's table with her head slightly bowed, yet constantly darting around the room, tried to maintain an air of composure, but the tremor in her hands and the subtle quivering of her lips betrayed the anxiety she had worked so hard to conceal. Her once commanding presence had dissipated entirely, replaced by a palpable desperation as the officers who had apprehended her that fateful day recounted, in calm and precise detail, the events leading up to her arrest. Every stolen item, every frantic movement, every witness account was documented and presented, leaving no room for doubt or distortion. Mr. Jenkins sat quietly in the front row, his hands folded calmly on his lap, embodying dignity and resilience, while neighbors who had once quietly endured Karen's petty tyrannies now leaned forward in collective anticipation, their eyes fixed on the unfolding truth. The judge, a figure of impartial authority, listened attentively as evidence was presented, occasionally jotting notes in a manner that conveyed both seriousness and an understanding of the broader implications of the case. Karen's attempts at self-justification, her assertions of victimhood and misinterpretation, were systematically dismantled by the testimony of officers, neighbors, and the irrefutable visual evidence that had been captured during her criminal intrusion. With each revelation, her posture sank, her voice grew quieter, and the audience in the courtroom could almost sense the weight of inevitability pressing down upon her, a tangible force that left no room for escape or denial. Outside the courthouse, the neighborhood had gathered in anticipation of the verdict, forming a community vigil of sorts that reflected both relief and solidarity. Children, once restricted by fear of Karen's incessant enforcement, played freely in nearby parks, their laughter a symbolic chorus of liberation echoing through the streets. Neighbors exchanged knowing glances and soft smiles, their shared experiences of past harassment now transformed into a collective sense of triumph and unity. The air was filled with murmurs of reflection on the absurdity of Karen's obsession and the satisfaction of witnessing her long overdue accountability. When the judge finally announced the ruling, declaring Karen guilty of attempted theft, harassment, and multiple counts of HOA-related abuse, a wave of audible relief rippled through the courtroom and out into the streets, a release of tension that had built over months of fear, manipulation, and intimidation. Karen's face paled as the reality of her situation sank in. The courtroom, once a space she might have imagined she could influence through cunning and intimidation, now became the stage for her complete downfall, a mirror reflecting the consequences of unchecked obsession and entitlement. The police, who had remained vigilant throughout the proceedings, ensured that Karen's sentence was executed without complication, escorting her from the courtroom in a manner both firm and professional. Her protests, once filled with forceful declarations of authority, now sounded hollow and futile against the unyielding structure of law and community oversight. Mr. Jenkins, still composed and dignified, offered no gloating or triumphal gestures. Instead, he simply breathed a sigh of relief, the weight of months of fear and anxiety finally lifting from his shoulders. Around him, neighbors clapped quietly, exchanged hugs, and shared heartfelt congratulations, their interactions a tapestry of communal healing and the reaffirmation of trust. The story of Karen's downfall, captured in the vivid recollections of those who had witnessed her actions and amplified through local news coverage, became a defining narrative for Willow Creek, a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsessive control, the importance of solidarity, and the ultimate triumph of integrity over tyranny. In the days and weeks following the verdict, Willow Creek transformed. The oppressive shadow that had loomed over the neighborhood for years finally dissipated, replaced by a renewed sense of freedom and self-determination. Residents tended to their gardens, painted their fences, and engaged in recreational activities without fear of sudden fines or arbitrary enforcement. Community gatherings flourished, from potlucks to neighborhood cleanups, as the shared experience of overcoming Karen's obsession forged stronger bonds and a deeper understanding of collective resilience. Conversations that had previously been dominated by whispered fears and cautious complaints were now open, honest, and empowered, reflecting a neighborhood that had reclaimed not only its safety, but its voice. Children played without concern for HOA intervention, neighbors conversed freely across fences, and a sense of peace settled over Willow Creek that had been absent for far too long. Karen, now removed from any position of authority and fully aware of the consequences of her actions, became a cautionary figure, a symbol of obsession unchecked by morality or law. Her once dominant presence in the neighborhood was replaced by isolation, public scrutiny, and the undeniable truth that power derived from fear is fragile and temporary. The story of her attempted robbery, her failed manipulations, and her ultimate legal reckoning would be recounted for years, serving as both entertainment and a moral lesson for new residents and longtime neighbors alike. Willow Creek had endured, grown stronger, and emerged united, proving that even the most persistent attempts at domination could be overcome through courage, documentation, community vigilance, and unwavering adherence to the law. As the sun set over the streets, casting long shadows across manicured lawns and sparkling windows, a quiet sense of victory pervaded the neighborhood. The lake shimmered peacefully, children's laughter echoed across the yards, and Mr. Jenkins, once a target of obsession and fear, now stood as a quiet hero in a community restored to safety, freedom, and the simple joys of life uninterrupted by tyranny. Willow Creek, resilient and united, had reclaimed its heart, and Karen Thompson's era of fear had ended, leaving behind a legacy not of control, but of a cautionary tale, a story of justice served, and a neighborhood strengthened by adversity.